Right, let us come to the urgent question. David Simmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State if you'll make a statement on the Government's policy on council tax referendums in 2025-26.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the 2012-13 financial year, local authorities, fire authorities and police and crime commissioners are required to determine whether the amount of council tax they plan to raise is excessive. The Secretary of State sets thresholds on excessiveness, known as referendum principles, for different classes of authority. Since 2016-17, these thresholds have also included a social care precept, providing higher thresholds for authorities with social care responsibilities. Decisions on the council tax levels to set, or whether to hold a referendum to go beyond the referendum principles, sits with councils. But the Government has been clear that it expects the threshold to be maintained at the current level set by the previous Government. The OBR forecast of the last Government assumed council tax would increase by a 3% core plus an additional 2% for local authorities with adult social care responsibilities for the entirety of the forecast period. Mr. Speaker, we will set out further details in the local government finance settlement in the new year. Beyond that, we are determined to support local government and undo the mess that's been created over the past 14 years. That's why at the budget we announced over £4 billion in new local government funding, including an additional £1.3 billion in the local government finance settlement that, as the honourable gentleman will be well aware, been warmly welcomed by the sector.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Council tax funds around £20.5 billion of expenditure in England on social care, which is 61% of all council funding. And it is therefore of huge interest to our constituents. The Prime Minister and ministers have repeatedly told the House that we need to wait for the spending review and the local government finance settlement to know what's going to happen with the referendum limit, including at the dispatch box yesterday when the Prime Minister told my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, to wait. Shortly afterwards, the press were told that the 5% limit will remain in place. And Mr. Speaker, answers to parliamentary questions show that government are expecting spending power to increase by £3.7 billion, funded by grants of £1.3 billion. That demonstrates, Mr. Speaker, that the Chancellor's budget has opened up a £2.4 billion black hole, a £2.4 billion black hole in council finances. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, the County Councils Network has highlighted their concerns that although we don't yet have a formal statement in the House, there are proposals to change the way in which funding is allocated, further depriving those local authorities in urban, suburban and rural areas of the funding that they need. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to put two questions to the Minister. Firstly, will he promise the House today that the funding allocations through the grant mechanism will follow the cost pressures on local authorities and not any other form of indexation or formula to ensure that places facing the highest costs receive the funding that they need? And next, Mr. Speaker, whilst nobody would want to see the referendum limit scrapped simply to bail out central government, the announcement of the 5% constrains local authorities when it comes to their fundraising. So can the Minister tell the House, will it be our high streets through increased business rates, or will it be other council services through significant cuts that will need to fill their £2.4 billion black hole?
Good questions. Well done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his questions. Let me take them both in turn. The Government are committed to a fair funding settlement for local government. We will set out further details in the usual way in the upcoming local government finance settlement, which will be presented to Parliament. On the £2.4 billion figure, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, we simply don't recognise it. And I assume that the honourable gentleman, in his calculations, has failed to take account of the over £300 million raised in business rates, £300 million in additional new houses to come along. So, yes, it is right, Mr. Speaker, that £1.8 billion will be raised through council tax in 2025-26. But as I made clear, Mr. Speaker, that is because the Government are clear that we're maintaining the previous Government's policy on council tax in line with the OBR forecast made in March 2024. And I think the question for the opposition, Mr. Speaker, is are they saying that that cap should be abolished, as the Rebuilding the Road to Victory Conservative LGA Group documents called on for all caps to be removed? Or are they saying that limit should be reduced, which would be contrary to the policy that was in place when the now Leader of the Opposition was Local Government Minister?
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's well for us to remember why a number of our local authorities are faced with this decision and these really tight financial crises in terms of the funding crisis over the last 14 years, where a number of local authorities have had to make those difficult decisions. But I think also I'd like the Minister to highlight and answer how a number of our areas are facing major in-year cost pressures from things like temporary accommodation and SEND provision. Does the Minister agree with me that actually we need to accelerate the house building plan so that we can get local authorities back on a level playing field, so that our local residents are not going to see this cost increase in their council tax bills?
Well, I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for that question. She is absolutely right. After 14 years of previous government's record in office, local government is on its knees. We have a system on the verge of collapse. We had multiple years where in-year spending pressures were ignored. The headroom we've provided through the budget and the over £4 billion in new local government funding that I referenced earlier will give us the headroom, Mr. Speaker, to start to turn that system around, to get ahead of some of those challenges we're facing, whether it be the pressures on adult social care, on children's services, or homelessness costs as a result of temporary accommodation. And that is why, and this is within my specific remit of responsibilities, our house building programme, and in particular the increase in social and affordable housing supply we're committed to, is so important.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberal Democrats are deeply concerned that people are simply paying more council tax for fewer services. And this is quite clearly as a result of Conservative tax cuts and their failure to tackle social care. As a former council leader myself, Mr. Speaker, I know that the burden that councils have has increased to such an extent that they are now forced with impossible choices. The burden and the costs that councils of all colours have to face and shoulder as a result of the Conservative government's policies must be reviewed. So, can the Minister ensure that councils do not have to close libraries, cut bus routes and reduce road repairs in order to meet the growing demand for the most vulnerable members of our community? And despite the announcement in the budget, will the Minister also recognise the LGA analysis that actually councils face a £6.9 billion shortfall because of inflation, increased wage demands and demand pressures on local services?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the government certainly recognises the pressures on local authorities and the burdens placed on households as a result of 14 years in which local government was run down. And we are determined to turn that situation around, as I said, by providing the headroom that local authorities need to get ahead of some of these challenges that they've been facing for many years. And that is why the over £4 billion in new local government funding announced at the budget, including an additional £1.3 million in the local government finance settlement, has been so warmly welcome. That brings total real terms increase in core spending of around 3.2%, Mr. Speaker. We continue, as I said, to remain committed to the 5% referendum cap. That is the right threshold, we believe. We're also committed in terms of protecting the most vulnerable to the single-person discount and local council tax support schemes, which mean, as the honourable gentleman I'm sure is aware, that more than 8 million households do not pay a full council tax bill.
Clive Betts.
I really don't know how the opposition spokesperson can stand there and talk about cuts and shortfalls with a straight face. We know where responsibility lies, and on the Lib Dem benches as well.
No, I'm sure you will want that Yorkshire cup of tea, because it's going to be coming very quickly if this carries on. Clive Betts, 2 Yorkshiremen.
If I just take my humble friend a trip down memory lane. When I first became a councillor, only 48 years ago, the councils had the freedom to raise both rates for domestic and non-domestic property. Shouldn't we at some point start a conversation with councils and the public more widely about whether thresholds at all are appropriate? Councils in this country have less freedom to raise local taxation than virtually any other councils in Western Europe, and council tax itself is regressive both between individuals and between different local authorities. Can't we start that conversation at some point?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that point, and I will relay it to the local government minister. But on the general principle, we are determined to rebuild local government from the ground up. That's why we're providing multi-year funding settlements to councils. That's why we're removing a number of ring fences, and why we're committed, as I previously said, to fair funding. On his general point about the opposition, I completely agree with him. Reminds me, Mr. Speaker, of a phrase my nan used to use: more front than Harrods, she used to say. That's what the opposition benches has got.
Glenn.
Speaker, would the Minister, as part of his deliberations, rule out any additional council tax bans in any future changes that this government might make?
Well, I'd say to the honourable gentleman, we're not talking about council tax bans in this urgent question. We're talking about the thresholds that remain in place. We're committed to those thresholds, but we will set out more details, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure you would expect, about local government finance settlement at the appropriate point next year in the usual way.
Coulter.
Mr. Speaker, areas like Hull City Council was savaged by the previous government in terms of funding, absolutely savaged, to the point where they were almost on the knees. So would my honourable friend the Minister tell the House what the government are doing to address areas of high deprivation like Hull?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. He is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. The damage done to local government over 14 years of the Conservatives in office is profound. We've inherited, as I said, a system on the verge of collapse. We are absolutely committed, as part of rebuilding that system from the ground up, to a fair funding settlement. And my honourable friend, the local government minister, will, as I say, announce more details in the upcoming local government finance settlement in the new year.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local authorities across the country will welcome multi-year settlements so they can plan for the future. However, does the Minister have any plans whatsoever to do a revaluation of properties, given that properties were valued originally back in 1992 when council tax began? The honourable gentleman from Sheffield South East and I produced a report on the last committee process on actually what you could do to enable councils to not be strictly neutral in terms of finance, but also revalue properties to bring them up to date.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. He tempts me to discuss the local government finance settlement ahead of it being formally presented to this House, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid I can't do that, but the government have heard his point. That I will ensure it's passed on to the local government minister.
Tristan Osborne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As a councillor myself, we saw 14 years of austerity and cuts on local government, with a 93% cut equivalent to my council in Medway. The opposition Medway Conservative Group have recently stated that not only would they scrap the recent council tax cap, but also introduce a local income tax on residents. Does the Minister agree with me that there needs to be consistency when it comes to this issue, and not the approach of the opposition, which in one case is to say scrap the cap and on the other to keep it?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and we still haven't had an answer, Mr. Speaker. We don't know what the opposition's position on this matter of thresholds is. We are in government. This honourable gentleman chunters from a sedentary position. We are in government, and we've confirmed that when it comes to thresholds, we intend to maintain the position as under the previous government, and that is baked into the OBR forecast over the spending period. But the opposition really do have to answer this question, Mr. Speaker. Are they saying the thresholds should be removed or increased, or are they saying they should be reduced and core services cut?
It's not for them to answer the questions. They are in opposition. Dame Harriet Baldwin.
The Chancellor and the IMF are known to favour ending council tax and replacing it with a wider property tax. The Welsh Labour government tried to revalue all the properties in Wales for council tax purposes. Can the government rule out doing either of those things?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to get into speculating about more fundamental reform of the council tax system. As I've said on a number of occasions already in response to this urgent question, the government will set out its position on the thresholds and other matters in respect of the local government finance settlement at the appropriate point early in the new year.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, York is the lowest funded unitary authority in the country and yet has one of the highest costs of living and therefore puts real pressure on our local authority. However, we're also some of the poorest funded for health, fire and police as well. So when looking at the funding formula for local government, will he also look at the presumptions which are made to ensure there is greater equity in the way that the formula is put together?
Minister. I thank my honourable friend for that question. As I've said repeatedly, and I commit to again, we are determined to ensure there is a fair funding settlement for local government. And as I said, more details will be forthcoming in the settlement in the early next year.
James Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour used to say that they would freeze council tax. So can the Minister now confirm their policy is actually to put council tax up because of the flawed, broken promise on national insurance?
Minister.
No, that's not the case, Mr. Speaker. We are maintaining the policy of the previous government, which, as per the OBR forecast, estimates that a £1.8 billion will be raised through council tax. That is the position of the government, to maintain those thresholds. If the honourable gentleman thinks otherwise, I think he should tell the House what his position is on the matter of those thresholds. Should they be reduced or should they be increased?
Jane Kirkhope.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although I'm very pleased with the support for first and second tier councils and the commitment to fair funding, which will be make a real difference in places like Cornwall. In unitaries like Cornwall, where a lot of services have been shed, larger town councils have had to step up and take the strain, and they haven't had those kind of grants and measures that have been available to first and second tier councils. Would the appropriate minister be able to meet with me to discuss the position of some of those larger town councils within Cornwall?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I'm more than happy to commit my honourable friend, the local government minister, to a meeting with her.
Go on, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The government yesterday at Prime Minister's questions accepted they were giving £600 million to local councils as a maximum, but the LGA have said there's £2.4 billion of pressure. Does the right honourable gentleman therefore accept that councils are going to have to increase council tax by around £1.8 billion, finding that gap between what the government is offering them and what they actually need in order to provide those local services?
Minister. I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As I've made clear, we don't recognise the £2.4 billion figure. I think it fails to take into account increases that I've already mentioned, for example, £300 million increase in business rates income, £300 million increase in income from new additional houses. So we don't recognise that figure. He's absolutely right that we expect council tax to raise £1.8 billion in 2025-26. That is in line with the previous government spending plans and baked into the OBR forecast as of March 2024.
Durham Puffin.
Council leader, I do sit somewhat amazed at the collective amnesia of the party opposite, who once again, as the opposition spokesperson, refers to what constrains local government spending power. Would my honourable friend agree with me that it's cuts of 60%, like Southampton City Council has suffered over 14 years, that have really cut that power? And would he agree that rather than faux outrage, what we need is an apology?
Minister.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. We deserve an apology. I doubt we'll get one. Before 2010, Mr. Speaker, it was vanishingly rare for councils to fall into serious financial difficulty. Since then, 9 councils have been affected in just 14 years, and there is a pattern here. For too long, the Conservative government not only failed to carry out their duty to local government, but hollowed out frontline services and crashed the economy. We are turning that round with the support we're providing to local government in the budget. We'll set out more details in the local government settlement, as I mentioned, in early next year.
James Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, the Minister will know just that while we don't have council tax per se in Northern Ireland, the pressures on family finances in Northern Ireland are on par with those on the UK mainland. Government, I believe, needs to be clear just how much further average families are going to see their finances stretched under this government. This is indeed a very worrying trend. What extra help can families, especially disabled families, expect to see in this year?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and it relates to a previous one, Mr. Speaker, which is that I think the opposition in their question have failed to account for the various other sources of support we're providing to families. Continuing the Household Support Fund, £1 billion, a £1 billion uplift for special educational needs, UK SBS funding of £900 million. The list goes on, Mr. Speaker. We're providing that support, but if the honourable gentleman wishes to discuss the specific conditions in Northern Ireland further, I'm more than happy to pass that request on to the local government minister.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my register of interests as a Vice President of the LGA, which members on the opposition front bench might also want to reflect on. Does my honourable friend agree that he mentioned front, I might mention it seems like a brass neck coming from the opposition benches to talk about their concern over pressures that local councils face after 14 years of Conservative, initially with the Liberal Democrats, austerity is what was the result, is what caused so many councils, including Luton Council, to be devastated in terms of their ability to provide services to much-needed families in our constituencies.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I've been a local councillor. Many members of this House have been a local councillor. The honourable gentleman has been a council leader. He will know what has happened to the system over the past 14 years. And the opposition continue, Mr Speaker, to claim there is this multi-billion-pound black hole in local council budgets. When asked how they would fix it, however, they said, quote, "It's not for us to do. We're in opposition. It's for the government." It's a classic policy of no plan to fix the mess they behind, no clarity on their position on thresholds, and a failure to take responsibility for what they've done over 14 years in government.
Daniel Francis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My Conservative-controlled council in the London Borough of Bexley had to apply for a capitalisation order 3 years ago and make 15% of our staff redundant. Despite that, it's still overspent its budget every month for over 2 years and is currently overspending on the safety valve agreement agreed with the previous government. In addition, the Conservative leader of the council, in a question from me last year, accepted that she was part of the LGA Conservative Group Executive that published their manifesto last year, asking their own government to remove caps on council tax. Given this, does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's rank hypocrisy from the party opposite to complain now about black holes in council finances?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I absolutely do. And what the government are determined to try and extract from the opposition is some clarity on their position on thresholds. Do they agree, as I said, Mr Speaker, with the Conservative LGA group that has called for the caps on council tax to be removed? Do they want those caps to be reduced? We're still none the wiser. Hopefully in the weeks and months to come, we can find out.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. As a member of a council for more than 30 years, like other members of this House, I have to say that I'm still one, I have to say that I haven't met a single councillor from any political party across the local government family in the last few years who doesn't believe that local government finance is in the worst state that it's been for decades. But on the subject of council tax, latest LGA figures indicate that in Labour authorities, council tax is £276 a year lower than in Conservative authorities. Does the Minister agree that shows that Labour councils and the Labour Party and the Labour government provide better value for money?
Minister.
Thank my honourable friend for that question. He's absolutely right, Mr Speaker. Labour councils charge less on average than Tory councils, and the councils with the lowest rates of council tax are all Labour. Council tax bills in Labour councils are on average £345 less than Tory councils. When it comes to local government financing, when it comes to council tax pressures, people are right to vote Labour in these areas would ensure their council taxes are at a lower rate than if they were under a Conservative local authority.
Emily Donald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As a former local government leader, does the Minister agree with me that we should be thanking local authority leaders for keeping services going during 14 years of austerity? Especially Labour leaders like Pete Marlin at Milton Keynes City Council, who've not only kept weekly bin collections, children's centres opened and reduced rough sleeping, while keeping council tax lower than its neighbouring Tory authorities. Does he agree with me that instead of using them like to make cheap political points, the party opposite should be thanking them and apologising for the 14 years of austerity?
Yes.
Mr Speaker, I think my honourable friend makes a good point, and I would extend our appreciation as a government to all local government leaders, and I mean that in a cross-party spirit, for what they have done to keep services going under the pressures they've faced over the past 14 years when the previous government ran down local government. We should be thanking them. This government does so. We want to consult with them on how we rebuild the system after those 14 years of pressure. And we'd be more than happy, Mr Speaker, as I said, to work across the chamber with a mature cross-party conversation about how we fix this mess. That won't happen if the political game playing from the opposition continues.
That completes the urgent question. Let the front bench change over.